Hi, I'm John Serruto, and welcome to this hometown special. I am joined with John Florio and Ouise Shapiro, authors of a new book, One Nation Under Baseball. It's a discussion of how the 1960s collided with our national pastime, and welcome. Thank you for coming out from Brooklyn.
Thank you for having us.
You know, John, you think about why you would pick this topic to cover. It's compelling. What was the thought behind it?
And it's a large topic, too, to get into between two covers. We didn't start out with that topic. We started out looking at the book Ball 4, Jim Bouton's big tell-all in 1970. You know, this was the first book that really took the locker room door off its hinges, let readers come with him to see the inner workings of a team, what they were talking about when they were off the field. A lot of salacious stories for the time. And it was such a big book that we thought there's a real story here. So we started thinking, well, let's look at the events that led up to Ball 4. And we said, well, you know, publishing obviously is a big one. And then that really, there was a turn that kind of started in the early 60s and brought us to 1970, which is when the book came out. We said, well, you know, other things, you know, really the labor, the players union had something to do with it too. So we had another arc there. And then we said, well, you know, race had a lot to do with it as well. And as we started looking at it and mapping it out, we realized, wow, you know, the 60s changed a lot of things. It's more than just Ball 4. Ball 4, certainly, a lot of it. But we decided, you know, I think that we need to zoom out, tell the story of baseball in the 1960s, all of the stuff that was happening in society and culture, how it impacted the game, and the reverse of it, how the game impacted society in some cases.
So you followed the evolution through the decade to that point in 1970. But,
Yeah.
you know, Ouise Shapiro, what was life like prior to 1960? What was it like for the post-war society?
Very different from the 60s. You know, it was the Eisenhower era. I think that people were very accepting of what was going on in society, and it was so close to the end of World War II. And I think people were just glad to get back on their feet after the war. And I don't think people were questioning what was going on in society, and especially where race is concerned. And I think it really wasn't until the early 60s that things changed markedly.
Well, the 1960s start off with a new election, new candidates, and of course your book opens up with one of those candidates, John Kennedy, meeting with a Cleveland pitcher, Jim Mudcat Grant. Why?
Why did Kennedy do it, or why did we start the book with that? Or
well,
both. Well, Kennedy called Mudcat Grant when Grant was in town. Kennedy was the senator at that time, and he wanted to become. He was following Larry Doby and some of the black players who were breaking the color line in baseball, and he wanted to speak with Mudcat Grant about his experience with that. He wanted to become more in touch with the black community, and that meeting took place in the beginning of the 60s, and we were looking at each other saying, well, how are we going to tell this story? We kept coming back to that moment because it launched those three arcs that we were just talking about. It's the beginning of the race arc. It's the beginning of a political arc. It's the beginning of a lot of the things they spoke about in the discussion lead us forward. You know, we tell that story. We also talk at that point about Jackie Robinson, who at the time is a Nixon fan, Nixon supporter, and he felt that Kennedy wasn't in touch with the black community. He felt that Nixon would be. That he changed his attitude on that later on in the 60s. But the Mudcat Grant story led us to the Jackie Robinson story and the Nixon story, which just starts opening everything up for us to start leading into these different directions.
Well, you know what, you talk about race and race relations, and you know, Ouise and I, you and I were having a discussion prior to this, and I shared a story that I was talking to someone about 25 years younger than me, and I mentioned the Jim Crow laws, and they looked at me like, what are the Jim Crow laws? Can you explain to the public what it was like back then?
The Jim Crow laws were sort of an extension of the end of slavery. They came about after the slavery during Reconstruction, and it was in the South primarily, in the Deep South, and they were de facto laws that segregated African Americans from white Americans in every phase of society, every public facility, the schools, drinking fountains, baseball parks.
Yeah, and then the rule, it was called separate but equal, right? But it was anything but equal.
Right.
And, you know,
Right, so the Constitution said, well, the facilities can be separated as long as they're equal, but they weren't equal. In fact, all of the facilities available to African Americans were inferior to those available to whites, and the Jim Crow laws went on for decades and decades and decades. And even we talk about it in the book, because in 1960 and 1961, when the Major League Baseball players go down to Florida for spring training, they're subjected to Jim Crow laws. And you have major stars. You have, Henry Aaron, and you have Willie Mays, and they can't stay with their team. They can't eat dinner with their team because they can't go to the restaurants, and they are forced to go to the black side of town, and where they have to stay in rooming houses, and where the restaurants serve colored. And it was, I think a lot of people don't even realize that this was going on as late as the early 60s.
Yeah, I think that the perception at the time was that baseball was ahead of society because Jackie Robinson broke the color line in 1947. Now, we're writing this book, we're talking about players, some players from the North coming south, some really from all over, but players from the North weren't as accustomed to it. They come to the South for spring training in Florida, and all of a sudden they have these Jim Crow laws separating blacks from whites. Everything's completely segregated. So while the public perception was that baseball was integrated in 1947, there was a handful of black players, 1 or 2 on each team, and that was really it. And there was still segregation going on. It was going on in spring training. It was going on in the South. So that was really, when we start the book, there's segregation in baseball in the early 60s, despite the fact that Jackie Robinson had broken the color line, 14 years earlier.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The percentage of black players in Major League Baseball in 1960 was, I think it was 8%, John?
No, I don't even think it was that much, was it? It was like low, like
lower,
5 or 8%.
and then 10 years later, it's
up like 14%.
14%.
Yeah.
So I mean, the game was hardly integrated.
Well,
in the early
you
60s.
highlight a story in there in St. Petersburg, or I guess the Chamber of Commerce was having a welcoming dinner for our luncheon for the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Yankees, and Bill White, who was at one point thinking about becoming a med student, eventually was a Cardinal, and he did not, as Bob Gibson and Ellie Howard, did not get the message that they were invited to this Chamber of Commerce meeting because they weren't staying in the same hotel. Mm-hmm. How did the players respond to that, their own teammates?
Well, we spoke with Jim Bouton about that. We spoke with a number of players, but Jim Bouton, I think, was the most articulate when it came to this particular issue. We said to him, you were down in North Carolina during the sit-ins in Woolworths. You were there at spring training when the segregation was going on. Like, was it on your mind? Like, what were you thinking at this time? Of course, we're hoping for a bombshell because we're writing a book about the 60s colliding with baseball. We want to hear, oh, yeah, the players were all over this. But he said, the truth was they weren't. He said his concern, and he said, I feel badly looking back at this now, but at the time, as a 19-year-old kid, his concern is his pitching mechanics. He just wants to make the team. He said everybody just wanted to make the team. They wanted to be sure they weren't going to be cut. They were protecting their salaries. That all felt like noise coming from the outside world, and we were in our own kind of world. And that's how things start. But of course, those walls start crumbling down as the years move forward.
Yeah, not Bob Gibson, but Bill White, who was Bob Gibson's teammate, first baseman for the Cardinals, he was not accepting of what was happening, and he was one of the very few African-American players to speak out. And he did an interview with Joe Reichler, who was then an AP reporter. And he said, this isn't fair, this whole breakfast that's being held down here, and we're not invited. And Joe Reichler put it out on the wire, and it got picked up by a lot of newspapers, especially African-American newspapers. And there was a big campaign on the part of a black sports writer named Wendell Smith. And he made it his goal in life to integrate baseball and to get rid of the Jim Crow laws. And he made a big stink about it and wrote many, many articles about it in the early 60s.
Yeah, I think one of the differences there, by the way, between Bill White and Jim Bouton is obviously that Bouton is white. He wasn't subject to the same indignities that Bill White and these other players were. So it's when we were speaking to Bouton about it, it was really more, look, on the outside of this, were you aware of what the other guys were going through? We spoke with Bill White about it, and of course, you have a different answer because he's on the receiving end of it. Ultimately,
by Bill White standing up to this, they were included in the breakfast.
Oh, absolutely. I think, in this world, in this book, Bill White is a civil rights leader. He's a civil rights icon. I mean, he really stood up and fought when a lot of other guys were just accepting it, not because they didn't believe in it, they didn't think anything could be done. you know.
And the other thing, too, is that Bill White grew up in a small town in Ohio, which was integrated. And
Right.
even though he had been subjected to racism in his town, it was nothing compared to what he was experiencing in Florida.
But I think John and Ouise, you know, that is just a great example, I think, of basically the theme of the book. That for the first time, as you mentioned, prior to the 60s, we went along with what the establishment had put out there for us to do. And now you're seeing individuals and you're seeing institutions taking a stand against many of the wrongs that were out there that people accepted.
Right.
One of the great events in the early 60s, of course, was the newspaper strike and how that changed so much of society. You know, the way we got our information, what was reported. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was the 1962-63 newspaper strike in New York. And believe it or not, in New York City back then, there were 7 daily newspapers. And there was a strike on the part of the typographers union.
Yeah.
And the whole strike was over automation because all these typographers thought that they were going to lose their jobs to automation, which did eventually happen. But all 7 newspapers went out, and only 4 survived. 4 or 3? 4 survived.
4 survived.
4 survived. And you had millions of people not reading the newspaper and not getting their news, not getting their sports news. And the strike went on for many months. It started at the end of, in December of, I think it was actually New Year's Eve, 1962, and didn't end for 5 more months. And it was devastating to the newspapers. And a lot of them were on shaky ground anyway. And then...
Well, you know, you look at the ripple effect, too.
Yeah.
Because now those people who weren't getting their news start turning to other channels. They start going to television, which, you know, you have the advent of TV at that point. But one of the even the more important ripple effects is the writers themselves. They now don't have jobs. I mean, Dick Young, a syndicated writer, actually prospered during that time because he was syndicated beyond New York. But you look at guys who were like Gay Talese, Tom Wolfe, other writers who left and started looking for longer form. They went to magazines. They're writing longer form articles. And they start to now that they've got some real estate that they can cover and really write what they're thinking, they start tearing down a little bit of the walls. You know, one famous piece is Frank Sinatra Has a Cold by Gay Talese. He took down the wall of mythology. He showed Frank Sinatra as a man, you know, as a human being. All of his warts and his wrinkles and whatever. He's imperfect, but he's perfectly Frank Sinatra, you know. And he did the same with Floyd Patterson. He did a lot with these heroes. Well, that new journalism, that phase of writing called new journalism, is paving the road ultimately to what we spoke about before, which is the book Ball 4. So that newspaper strike brought a lot of change because you have the writers starting to write differently. You have the readers starting to look for other channels. When things resolved and you have the 4 papers running up and running again, it's not the same world it was when they first went on strike.
Well, you have this confluence all of a sudden, as you mentioned, the advent of TV, so you had a different type of reporter going on. How did that affect the writers when all of a sudden you had electronic reporting
Tell them about Dick
going
Young.
on?
The writers hated. There was a war between the print writers and the TV reporters. And Dick Young, who John had just mentioned, he was a syndicated columnist with the New York Daily News, and his readership was well over 2 million daily readers. And at that time, he was probably the most widely read sports writer in the country. And he absolutely loathed and resented the TV reporter. So he's
an old school blue collar man's writer. You know, wrote for the blue collar worker. Go
right.
ahead.
So he would do anything he could to thwart the interviews that were taking place in the locker room. He would pull the plug on the equipment. He would stand in front. He would stand in front of the camera and
curse
swear.
So they couldn't show it on the air. Anything he felt, we are protecting our turf. This is a turf war. You know, and he protected it any way he could. He'd trip over the wires, he'd push them aside, he'd bump the camera, anything he could to ruin their shot.
Well, you had the other famed columnist, of course, Jimmy Cannon, who really had a dislike for what he had seen with the new reporter. Share that story.
Well, Jimmy Cannon, he was also old school, and there was
older school even than Dick Young.
Yeah, it's true. And there was a whole crop of new young reporters, sports writers that came out of colleges, as opposed to guys like Dick Young and Jimmy Cannon, who came up as copy boys right out of high school. And So one day in the press box, a bunch of the young writers were chattering away, and Jimmy Cannon said, "You guys, you sound like a bunch of chipmunks," and he meant it as an insult, and they took it as a badge of honor. Oh, we sound like chipmunks. They made sweatshirts that said, and T-shirts that said chipmunks on it, and they actually had quite a different attitude about the television reporters, because they didn't feel that they were being threatened by the TV reporters. They thought we can all work together. It's no big deal.
Same generation.
Yeah.
You know, they wouldn't be protecting their own turf. They hadn't established their own turf yet, so it was different for them.
Right.
Well,
But, go ahead.
did those reporters now report differently about the person? Did we find out more about them versus just what took place in the game?
Yeah, a lot of those writers were afternoon writers. Not all of them, but a lot of them were afternoon writers, which meant now we're in a slightly different world than we had been in. So sports fans have already gotten the score in the morning edition. They already know the nuts and bolts of the game. Now they've got to fill some space in the afternoon. So these guys are writing human interest stories. This guy pitched the game, you know, for his father, you know, or his father was at the game and he wanted to impress his old man who taught him how to pitch, whatever they're writing. But the idea is it's not somebody got up and went 3-2 and got a base hit in the bottom of the ninth, you know. So those stories start also contributing to the breaking down of the myths, because it's not all about what happens on the field now. These guys are starting to write stuff that's happening off the field, which is happening at the same time as the new journalism and the other things. It's kind of just a perfect storm or a wave that's all coming at the same point. The time was right for the chipmunks, right? Because you have these young, educated guys coming during the advent of TV at a time when afternoon papers were starting to let them write things that were more than just the story. And naturally, they were going to start gravitating towards those stories and picking them up. You know, this is also the time that the Yankees are starting to crumble. They've been bought by CBS. They're not the dominating team they were. And you got the Mets coming on, and the Mets are nothing on the field, but they're filled with stories like this. So the chipmunks gravitate toward them. And in New York, they've got this fertile ground of material.
Yeah, and they had no problem demythologizing the players, the chipmunks, but they also they wanted to write about the personal side of the ball players. And you know, writers like Dick Young and Jimmy Cannon were appalled, because they thought that that's all, you don't write about what goes on off the field.
So for previous years, going way back to the 20s, they just reported about the game. They weren't talking
Sure.
about what Babe Ruth was doing at night or who Joe DiMaggio was hanging around with,
Right.
moving up the ranks. Let's talk about a couple of the ball players. And maybe you can tell us about what was going on in their lives. You know, we discussed there was an incident back in the mid-'60s with the Dodgers and the Giants. Johnny Roseboro, you know, the catcher of the Dodgers, and Juan Marichal, the great pitcher of the Giants, and Koufax and Marichal are pitching against one another, and they were heated rivals anyway. There were a couple brushbacks, but it really turned into a nasty situation. But there was a lot more going on in their lives that the public didn't realize back then. Can we share that, how these people are actually human?
Right. Well, that was the Watts riots had broken out in 1965, and which was in L.A. and in the African American neighborhood of L.A. And Johnny Roseboro, who you said was the catcher for the Dodgers, he lived on the fringes of Watts, and he was very nervous about protecting his home and his family during the riots. And he even used to sit out on his porch and with a gun late at night in fear that his family was going to be attacked. And at the same time, there was a civil war going on in the Dominican Republic where Juan Marichal had grown up, and Juan Marichal was unable to get in touch with his family. He'd been trying to reach them. So when the two teams, sort of toward the end of the riots, when the two teams were playing each other, which was also during a pennant race, there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of tension on the part of both of these guys. And I think they just came to blows. I mean, I think they were both, you know, very reasonable guys. I just think they had to let off steam.
They were both ready to blow. They were both ready to go, and you know, they both went off at the same time. But it had nothing to do with what was really going on the field. I mean, that was kind of an excuse for them to get this kind of anxiety out. And that's an example of like the types of things that made us, as we were researching the book, those were the stories that we really enjoyed finding and researching, because that's an example of society and culture affecting baseball, affecting what was going on in the game. It affected a pennant race, and it's also baseball affecting culture too, because now you have people who are in the Watts area watching this, fights going on, their tempers are going up, after watching this. So it's a give and take kind of situation, and that's the ebb and flow that we try to capture from the beginning of the 60s to the end of the 60s.
Go ahead,
sorry.
Ouise.
I also think that a lot of people think that baseball has always existed in a bubble, separate and apart from what's going on in society, but you can see in the 60s that really wasn't the case at all. Baseball was very much affected by what was going on around the game.
Well, Ouise, let me ask you this, because you and I also grew up during this era, and we talked about the impact of 3 assassinations. We talked about the impact of this war that nobody really understood way out in Southeast Asia. How did that play a role in society and within baseball?
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you.
Full disclosure, this is a married couple, just
Right,
so you
so
know.
we have the right to volley this back and forth. No, well, I think Vietnam is hanging over everybody's head. I mean, you have a war going on, and what we do in the book is we show it happening, how it's affecting a few different things. There's the Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali line. There's other situations where Vietnam is affecting. That's the society part. In baseball, what we found is, far fewer players went to Vietnam than went to World War II. If you look back, a lot of guys, the big guys, Ted Williams, these guys are going off to war. Yet it wasn't really happening in the Vietnam War, and we tried to figure out why did this not happen? Why was this not happening? And we tracked down a prospect from the Tigers. His name is George Gamelch. He's also an author and an anthropologist now, an anthropology professor, and we were speaking with him about it. And he, at the time, had a deferment because he was taking a correspondence course. He has a PhD now, and he's a teacher. At the time, he was taking a correspondence course, and that qualified for a deferment. Eventually, that deferment went away, and we'll talk about that in a second. But right now, he's on that deferment, and he's studying, and he walks into the front office, and he looks up, and he sees that the general managers have a list of all the players and prospects in the organization, and they have a code next to their name. And he realized what was happening was they weren't necessarily protecting them or pulling strings. I don't think they had that kind of power, and they also weren't doing that. But what they were doing is guiding the players, helping them get into the National Guard, take a correspondence course, do these things, the advice you would need not to be drafted, which a lot of young men in America probably would have liked at the time. But they were being helped and guided through the system. As it turns out, in George Gamelch's case, the deferment went away, and he and 2 players who didn't see it coming for various reasons, in his case, because the deferment changed, have to go, and they've been drafted, or they're going for their physical. And on the way, they're in the bus, and he tells a very funny story. I mean, it's kind of a serious, sad, tragic story on one hand, but it's also funny on the other. They're trying to figure out how to flunk the exam. They're saying we will drink dishwashing fluid, we'll eat soap, we'll do all these things that will change our blood levels. And he said, what was interesting, he says nobody thought it wasn't patriotic at the time. He said it was not a question of patriotism. It was nobody wanted to go to this war. So he said he went up and he feigned not hearing them when they spoke. They called his name, he didn't answer. They said, sign here. He didn't and eventually he wasn't accepted. He said, I'll never know. It might have been because of my hearing. He goes, I'll never know what the reason was, but I wasn't taken, and nor were the other 2 guys. But that's one example of how it affected the game, because you had these players being the general managers in the teams helping them through the system. Another one is that players, like a guy like Tom Seaver in '69, made a comment about Vietnam, like if the Mets can win this pennant, we can get out of Vietnam, and all of a sudden became a poster child, and a reluctant poster child for anti-war feelings, and stepped out and said, look, I'm not saying anything against the war, and I'm not saying it in a Mets uniform. After the season, I'll speak about it. And then when the time came later on, at the end of the year, he ran an ad, a prayer for peace from him and his wife Nancy at the time in the New York Times. So some players were taking stands against the war, like Tom Seaver, but he did it on his own time. Other players were going on tours, USO tours. We have in the book we mentioned that Joe Torre went on one. I think Hank Aaron was there, Stan Musial, Pete Rose, all of these guys went over to entertain the troops. But none of them really wanted to go and fight.
Well, taking a stand, and as we round down and wind down part one here, let's talk a little bit about taking a stand. Today's fan would never realize back in 1964 and 65 and 66, something called an agent in baseball didn't exist. Talk about Sandy Koufax, talk about Don Drysdale. We knew that Willie Mays at that point, I think, was the highest paid baseball player at $105,000. Mickey Mantle was making $100,000, and you had these two great pitchers from the LA Dodgers who were getting offered a lot less. And Sandy and Don Drysdale were hitting a stone wall with the Dodgers, and they decided to.
Exactly. So this was in the spring, that was spring training of '66. And Koufax and Drysdale were probably the two of the best pitchers in the National League, and they got together, and they were each they had gone out to dinner, and they were each complaining about the way that the front office had been treating them in terms of asking for raises. And at the time, Drysdale was married to a woman named Ginger, and she had been an actress and a model in Hollywood. And she said to them, well, why don't you just get an agent and go in and go in together and hold out. And they said, oh, there's no such thing as an agent in baseball. The owners would never allow it. And she said, well, there's nothing written that you can't have an agent, so why don't you just try it? So they thought, all right. So they hired, I think it was Sandy Koufax's attorney knew someone, and they hired him, and he went in, and he was their representative. And they said, we're no longer dealing with the front office individually. We are now a union, the two of us, and we have a spokesperson. And Walter O'Malley, the owner of the Dodgers, was furious, and but realized the team can't live without these two guys. There's no way they're going to win without Koufax and Drysdale. So they had to negotiate with them, and it went on all during spring training, and ultimately they didn't get what they had asked for. I think they wanted $1 million between the two of them.
The 3 years, two of them totaling $1 million. So it's a $1 million package. You get two guys for 3 years. And I forget what it came out to, but I think Koufax got a little more than Drysdale. But it was both six figures.
And I think Mr. O'Malley also wanted to make sure it didn't look like it was collective bargaining and it was even, so Koufax did.
And that's why the salaries were not exactly the same.
Yeah.
But again, at the beginning of collective bargaining,
Absolutely.
It's a union. It's only two people.
Which we will get into in part two with many other issues in this wonderful book and this basically history of the 60s and our national pastime. So I'm going to ask you to come back and join me in part two in just a minute.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for joining us in part one.